painting, and a few of these prints are basically about the rabbit. And so a lot of the environmental ideas and the historical references come from my great-grandparents moved out to Bathurst in about the 1840s. And so we still had farms that we could go to, and my parents ended up buying a farm out there. So every holiday, since I can remember, we used to go out there and we'd be trapping rabbits and we'd be shooting foxes and all those quite confronting type things. But I always put in humour, you know, there's the South City, there's a football reference, and there's the Opera House peeking over the top here, so there's all the nice contemporary references. This is the Duke of Edinburgh that came out. He was the first royal to come to Australia, and Thomas Austin. He was the fellow that actually brought out a lot of rabbits. The Duke of Edinburgh would come out and he would have shooting parties on this fellow's farm, and they would shoot hundreds and hundreds, and they'd have a team of people loading guns and firing away and all that. So I've sort of put in this sort of hunting garb to basically, I guess, mock them in a certain way. And then over in the side here I've got Henry O'Farrell, who was a mad Irish Republican, and when he came up to Clontarf in Sydney, he shot the Duke in the back. So it was the first sort of assassination attempt of a royal in Australia and what have you. But I often link my work with, you know, George Stubbs or Hogarth or Dormier, so there's a lot of historical references, and the cutting that I do is basically from the wood engravings from England from the 17th century, so I've sort of softened it slightly. But I take the liberty of sort of retelling or making up a contemporary narrative, and not necessarily getting on my high horse and soapbox and saying, hey, this is the way it was. I'm leaving options open so people can actually reinterpret and go, oh, did that sort of happen, or that's wrong, and because probably 50% of historical facts are wrong. Or they get distorted with time, and I'm sure this is my sort of version, but I'm not saying it's right or wrong, and I'm sure it will get reinterpreted, you know, down the past. It's hard because often there's such a depth of narrative and historical references that a lot of the galleries say, well, can you do an artist statement? And I'm dreadful at writing artist statements, so I either get someone else or do a hybridised version, so they don't have to remember what's in the work. Okay, most people tend to start with speedball, like these little beasties.
Yep.
And they, as far as sharpening, a lot of people, depends on the steel of your tools, and if it's not very good quality steel, this steel's not particularly good, but you can actually get wet and dry and actually sand them back. Most people do horrendous damage to their tools when they use sharpening stones.
Right.
If they don't know what they're doing, and often people are better to actually move the sharpening stone and hold the tool perfectly still.
Okay.
Or use the diamond, you know, the size of a credit card, and actually they're quite good using.
Okay.
But usually I use a strop, which is just basically leather with a jeweller's rouge. Right. And I will actually polish the metal rather than occasionally if you chip the top out or something like that, then you have to hit your sharpening stones.
Right.
And often you might use something that's like a 5,000 or an 8,000 grade, so they're really, really fine. People often use a tool, sharpening stone that's too coarse.
Yeah, well, the sharpening stone that comes with the...
And I always, oh yeah, they're atrocious, really.
Yeah, yeah.
And, well, one, the steel's dreadful, and the sharpening stones. And I always use water, I don't use oil. I know a lot of people, the old timers love the Japanese always, and you see the Japanese use, and they will actually have several sharpening things, and they will sharpen quite regularly. Yeah. But I don't, I tend to polish more than sharpen. So the main tools I use are speedball, there's the file, the Swiss, and they're probably the most popular around the world at the moment.
Okay.
And they're about
so
30 or 40. Fine.
V gouge, is it? Oh, yes.
It's a really fine V gouge. And the other one, I do use thicker ones as well, is this beautiful Japanese one that pulls off and that splays open, and then you've got that. So they're basically the sort of three. I've got these new French ones that are pretty good too, but I was seduced by the beautiful blended timber at the top there. So, and they're a bit similar to these, but so they're basically what I use. Well, this is one of a print that I did from the residency at Botanic Gardens, and I haven't done a lot of residencies, Taronga Zoo and Botanic Gardens and one or two others, and I hate the way artists will go and do residencies and they just continue doing the work they usually do instead of actually immersing themselves in the environment.
Taking it on.
So every print I wanted to do, I selected something from the gardens and made it quite a feature of the actual print, and it was the prickly pear. And obviously Sir Joseph Banks got them from Rio, brought them to Australia, and they wanted to produce cochineal for the red coats, for dyeing all the red coats collection. And I went to the educational section. I was staggered that they still had the good old man Banksia, the Snugglepot and Cuddlepie, and the Banksia men were this scary, horrendous way, and that was such an odd way of introducing people to young kids. Because I remember my grandmother sort of reading it, and I'm going, oh God, what an introduction to botany.
Yes, these fiends. Yeah.
And then I've the stingrays that reference the first mass killing in Australia, when they came into Botany Bay, and they'd been on the boat for months, years. They killed about 1,000 stingrays just as sport. They were shooting them and stabbing them, dragged them up onto the beach and did nothing with them. And they were actually going to call Botany Bay Stingray Bay.
Right.
And then there's Pemulwuy. That a medical fellow scientist in London said, I need some artefacts of indigenous people, and so he went Pemulwuy, who was 6 foot plus, and everyone was scared. He had one sort of roll the eye, and he was shot quite a few times, and he just digged the slugs out and sort of then attacked people.
So you don't use your spindle rollers for this, you use...
Well, it's a lot of people ask me that, Bill, because everyone thinks, you've got a large piece of lino, you should have a large roller, and I never do. And usually I'll use something like that, or something about this sort of size. And because often each lino each image is different as far as the way it gets inked up. So, and I find I have more control with these, because sometimes you might, if the sky is dark or light or foreground, or if the figure's got some really dark shadows, you will actually have to spot roll. And a lot of people don't do that. They tend to do this sort of one up, and so I've seen some printers count, and that might be okay for lithography or what have you. But with, and you can feather roll and roll into the centre and all those sorts of things.
I'm so glad you said that, because when I sort of do that, I feel like I'm cheating.
No, not at all. It's
just what you have to do to get print.
And that's when students are printing in colour and all those sorts of things, and using smaller rollers and all those sorts of things. So and there's a real skill to it. And I think one of the common problems or mistakes people will do is they actually charge the roller with too much ink to start with, and they'll power in with too much pressure, and they put this sort of heavy roller mark across everything. And then you virtually have to print that out, or occasionally clean the lino back. But I do get frustrated, and I might have a session of printing 5, because I don't print the whole edition with black and white. I don't have an air-conditioned studio, and you get cockroaches and silverfish and all that sort of thing, and I'm not going to spray and exterminate everything all the time. So if someone buys something, I make sure it's a fresh print. I don't get one old thing, because things fox and all that sort of business.
So, having said that, does that mean like you determine a number and you keep a record of?
I do.
And then you just like print to order.
Absolutely,
sort of thing?
yeah. So as something gets sold, and I write down who's bought it, where it's gone, whether it's framed, whether it's not framed.
What number it was?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. That's all done. And often when I enter work overseas, which I do a lot of, basically. They're all artist proofs because I know when they come back there's probably about 80% of them I'll have to tear up because they get dinged, they get damaged, they get wrecked, you know, so...
And the term foxing, is that something?
Oh, foxing, that's just... it is a common term, and it's just basically when you get mould growing on your print,
Yep.
and as it spreads and, yeah, so... Well, this is a one-off. I was listening to the radio, and the former director of the Australian Museum came on, and he was talking about Gerard Krefft, this fellow up here, and I thought, oh, this is a bit of interesting sort of narrative. So I went away and did some research, and then I found out about his chair that was still at the museum. So I dragged my poor wife in to photograph it for me. So we built it round the chair. And then I added bits and pieces and researching his history about, he was German, he was believed in Darwin's theories. Australia was very conservative and didn't aspire to any of his philosophies at all. So basically they worked very hard, William Macleay tried very hard to get rid of Gerard Krefft. You know, he was slightly eccentric, but he wrote the first book on snakes, Australian snakes. He wrote one of the first books on the mammals of Australia, including the thylacine. I'll put that up there for me. The Queensland lungfish. He sort of discovered that. Everyone said they were having a nice piece of salmon, but he went into the kitchen and found this salmon had lungs. So he travelled out in the outback, and they ran out of food. So it was rumoured that I think it was the pig-footed. I can't remember. There was some species, and so they believed that they ate the last. But he discovered a lot of limestone caves throughout Australia and all those sorts of things. It took me about 8 weeks just to do the chair, the leather on the chair and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So if you get into the zone, it's not too bad. It's the worst thing is actually when you're doing the background, and it takes so long, and then if you change tools or sharpen, and then you get slight variations, then it's a real pain to. But it looked like it was slightly aged and what have you, and this is the worst part to ink up. So when you're inking up, if you do, they're prone to roller marks and all those sorts of fun things. So I have torn up a few and sworn and cursed, which I tell my students never to do, but I do it as well. Yeah, I guess with my work it's hard to get blacks, strong blacks, greys and whites. And the blacks, you know, if you ink up too much, you'll fill in your fine greys. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I always tell my students that it's deception. It's all about. It's basically it's black and white, and to create your greys is the hard thing. And they broke down the door. He was in the chair. They picked up the chair and threw him into College Street, and he died a pauper.
Right. Okay.
And so it was only quite recently that they said, "Oh, possibly this person is worth recognising." So.
Because that's probably the unusual thing about a lot of your work is the size that you do.
Yes, and look, the trouble a lot of people have printing lino-cuts on an etching press. Ideally, you should print it on an Albion, or you should have the pressure coming directly down, from like you have with a hydraulic press.
Yeah.
By printing it this way, often your paper will stretch or move as it goes through the press. And the way I overcome that is You can either use magnets, or I put the, actually I can probably, I'll show you. And when I'm printing, I'll actually put the paper under here, flick it back over to the roller, and then roll it through, so you feed the paper through and it only touches the inked up lino once. It's because often when people have an inked up lino, they'll put the paper on top, and then by the time this engages, it actually shifts the paper, so you get that blurriness. And if I have blurring on my work, basically you may as well throw it in the bin, because you lose all that fine detail.
Right.
So just by flicking it over, and then it just feeds through naturally. You've got to hold the paper off as it goes through, and then you end up with a perfect print.
Right.
If you're lucky.
Don't use a blanket or anything like that?
That's a good one, Bill. I don't. And sometimes people use cardboard. Some people use offset blankets.
Yeah.
When occasionally I do use blankets, if I'm working with artists or students, it'll give you a softer print.
Yeah.
I don't want that with my work. Sometimes you use cardboard. If you've got a roller, and a lot of the presses that have been used for 20 years, they'll actually start to bow on the centre, and that's often why I use blankets sometimes, or cardboard, or the offset blankets, to compensate that.
Yeah.
But I tend to just print large works on this, so it hasn't bowed or buckled at all, so I can get a really even, because often you get a light band up the top and all that sort of thing. So I prefer, some people say you've got to watch out for rust and all that sort of business and what have you, but I don't use anything. A bit of OCD, so I always do registration in red permanent marker, and I always have to have red tape, which is a bit tragic. And I obviously have runners on the sides, and I have it beforehand, and because often people just have them on the ends, on the sides, and I have them on there as well. So you're, as one, it's better for the roller, so it doesn't jump and all those sorts of things. So it's
so you do it ink side up.
Yeah.
Obviously.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I guess that's the other thing with the pusher blanket, is that it pushes in, and you get this embossing.
Which it suits some images, and obviously people, not everyone cuts obviously like me, but if they cut it in a more expressive way, they actually do want to get that effect. So it's better if people try and whatever suits them or suits the liner.
Yeah.
So
what sort of paper do you use? You know, saying it's cost $20 a sheet.
BFK Rews. That's all I print on, and it does the job. It's not too coarse, it's not too grainy, it's great for black and white.
Okay.
If you're going to print a lot of colour work, you could find it stretch, because it does stretch when you do multi-plate etchings and that sort of thing. So yeah, you might use obviously a different sort.
So what sort of weight of paper?
It's a 300.
300, yeah.
When I'm printing that size, if you print a lighter weight, you'll end up having it cockle, because you'll flatten all the fibres in the centre where the lino is, and your edges aren't squashed, so they... So that's why I do that. If I'm printing smaller, I might drop down to 280 or 250 or something like that.
Yeah. So you don't have any problem with buckling with the 300?
No.
Okay.
If it does buckle, it's because I want too much pressure on the press.
Right.
That's, you know.
So I guess that's just one of those things, you've got to have it just right.
Well, yeah, you do have to have it right, and the best way to print is the least amount of pressure to get a good impression.
Yeah.
And and people always can get a good impression, but it's got too much pressure, and you'll find you'll fill in your lines and all those sorts of things, and you get the first one will be good, but the rest will be crap. So
do you set the press every time, or you just have it permanently set to that?
I always take the pressure off, because it's much better for the press, but I know how many half turns I have to do. So don't mess with those gauges.
So let it shine a bit.
Well, another secret. I sand the crap out of my lino, so I really get wet and dry on it, and I polish them so they're like glass.
Before or after?
Before.
Before you carve.
Yeah, and I might use, start at what I use 80 or 100, and then go down to about 1,000, 1,200, and actually really go through all the different grades and polish that so it is like glass. In my work, if it's not polished, when you go to print, your blacks just don't come up.
Okay.
And often the lino is really pitted, because when they make it, they actually store it when it's hot, and if it's stored on top, and often you will get the hessian from that will actually, sometimes you get that texture in the front of your lino.
Okay.
So
yeah,
I just, you don't have to do it with the vinyl of course, but with lino, so fine, you've got to sand them. That's why they're so smooth. But occasionally I might sand them accurately, and I might put a scratch in it, and then you've got this scratch in your lino. But it does make it easier.